Dubro Suspicion Files.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to try and unravel one of the most complex and honestly one of the most contested terror attacks in history, the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103.
270. On December 21st, 1988, that was the final devastating toll. 259 people on board the plane and 11 more in their own homes on the ground in Lockerbie, Scotland. It is still, to this day, Britain's deadliest terror attack.
You see, for decades, the story of Lockerbie has really been two stories, running side by side. The official verdict, the one that led to a conviction, points the finger directly at a Libyan plot. But there's always been this persistent shadow narrative, one that suggests a story of Iranian revenge, Syrian proxies, and maybe even a compromised CIA operation. So how is that even possible? How can one single event have two completely different, competing truths? That's the big question, right? So let's dig in. We're going to walk through the evidence for both sides of this story to understand why, after all this time, the truth of what happened to Pan Am 103 is still so hotly debated.
All right. First things first, to even begin to understand the mystery, you've got to understand the mechanics of the disaster itself. It all started 31,000 feet above the quiet Scottish countryside.
Now, the bomb itself was surprisingly small. We're talking only about 400 grams of Semtex plastic explosive. But here's the thing. It was all about location. Its placement inside a suitcase, just 25 inches from the plane's skin, created this devastating phenomenon called a Mach stem shockwave. Basically, the initial blast reflects off the fuselage and combines with itself, which multiplies the force of the explosion like crazy.
And the result of that? Just absolute, instantaneous catastrophe. We're talking 3 seconds. In just 3 seconds, the entire aircraft disintegrated. The cockpit voice recorder captured a tiny, faint sound, and then nothing. The crew had no time, no chance to even realize something was terribly wrong.
845. That's the size of the crime scene, in square miles. Think about that. Debris from that 747 just rained down across southern Scotland, turning this huge area of countryside into the largest, most complex crime scene in British history. So you've got this massive debris field, and now thousands of investigators have this almost impossible job of piecing it all back together. And the forensic trail they ended up following pointed them squarely at one country, Libya.
And what they did was honestly a masterclass in forensics. The whole thing came down to a few tiny, microscopic discoveries. Little fragments of a specific brand of suitcase, scraps of clothing that they traced back to a shop in Malta, and pieces of a Toshiba radio cassette player, the very device that was used to hide the bomb.
But this is what blew the case wide open. A tiny fragment of a circuit board, literally smaller than your fingernail. It was identified as part of a really sophisticated timer. Investigators were able to trace it all the way from a Swiss manufacturer straight to its only customer, Muammar Gaddafi's Libyan military. This tiny piece of plastic became the smoking gun, the physical link to Libya.
So with that smoking gun, prosecutors started to build their story, a very specific timeline. They claimed the bomb began its journey in Malta, where it was put into an unaccompanied suitcase, then routed through Frankfurt, on to London, and finally loaded onto Pan Am 103.
But here's where the story takes a sharp turn. Because before that tiny timer fragment pointed everyone towards Libya, the prime suspects were completely different, and their motive? It was crystal clear, pure revenge.
Okay, so get this. Just 5 months before Lockerbie, an American warship, the USS Vincennes, shot down an Iranian civilian passenger jet. All 290 people on board were killed. Iran called it a massacre and publicly vowed the skies would rain blood in retaliation. Intelligence even picked up chatter that Iran's interior minister put a $10 million bounty on any American airliner.
And this is where things get really weird, where the official story starts to look a little shaky. The original prime suspects were a Palestinian group backed by Syria and funded by Iran. And just 2 months before Lockerbie, German police raided one of their cells and found, you guessed it, bombs hidden inside the exact same model of Toshiba radio used to destroy Pan Am 103. The coincidence is just staggering.
And if you thought that was a crazy coincidence, listen to this. A super specific warning was received by the U.S. Embassy in Finland just 16 days before the attack. It named the airline, the route from Frankfurt, and the time frame. The warning was circulated inside government agencies, but it was never made public to passengers.
So you have to ask the really uncomfortable question, right? Why did the investigation suddenly pivot away from Iran and its Syrian-backed proxies? Well, the timing is interesting. It happened right as the U.S. was building a coalition for the first Gulf War, a coalition that desperately needed Syria's support. Blaming a Syrian-backed group for Lockerbie would have made that alliance totally impossible.
Okay, so the official case against Libya charges ahead. After years of sanctions, Libya finally hands over 2 of its intelligence agents for a very unique trial, held at a neutral site in the Netherlands. This is where the 2 narratives officially collided in a courtroom.
The trial was held in front of 3 Scottish judges, and it ended with a split verdict. One of the men was acquitted, but the other, Abdelbasset al-Megrahi, was found guilty of all 270 counts of murder and sent to prison for life. So, on the surface, it looked like justice was served, right? Case closed.
Well, not so fast. The verdict was immediately, and I mean immediately, torn apart by legal experts. Even the official United Nations observer at the trial, Dr. Hans Kochler, did not mince words. He called the outcome a spectacular miscarriage of justice. And one of the biggest reasons for that criticism? It comes down to this number, $2 million. That's the amount of money, it was later revealed, the U.S. Department of Justice paid to the prosecution's star witness, a Maltese shopkeeper. This massive payment was never disclosed to the defense or the judges during the trial. So what you have here is the very foundation of the official story, the conviction, resting on testimony that was not just paid for, but was also full of inconsistencies. In fact, years later, an independent Scottish legal commission looked at all of this and concluded the verdict was so flawed it was potentially unsafe.
And just when you think the story is over, that it's just a tragic piece of history, bam! Decades later, the U.S. Department of Justice opens a whole new chapter, bringing this story right back into the present.
In 2020, the U.S. charged a 3rd Libyan man, Abu Aguila Massoud, as the alleged bomb maker. But honestly, his case just shines a brighter light on this whole tangled web of questions that have never gone away. I mean, look at this list. The paid witness who undermines the original verdict, the Helsinki warning that suggests someone knew something was coming, and now the case against Massoud himself relies on a confession that his lawyers say was obtained through torture in a Libyan prison.
And that leaves us right here, with this one final question. A new trial is coming up, nearly 40 years after the tragedy. But is it finally going to give the victims' families the definitive truth they've been fighting for? Or will it just add another chapter to a curated history? A version of a story that's always been far more complicated than anyone wanted to admit. The search for closure over Lockerbie, it's still not over.